During the inheritance meeting, my daughter said, "You want half the inheritance? You deserve to live with the stray dogs." No one said a word. I closed the folder, stood up, and walked away. 3 days later, they got a surprise. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. You want half the inheritance? You deserve to live with the stray dogs." My daughter Nancy's words cut through the air like a knife, her face contorted with contempt. I sat frozen in the mahogany chair of the lawyer's office, my hands trembling slightly on the leather portfolio in my lap. The room fell deathly silent. No one spoke up. Not my son-in-law, Matthew, who simply adjusted his expensive tie with manicured fingers. Not the family lawyer, Mr. Patterson, who suddenly found his paperwork fascinating. Not even my sister-in-law, Judith, who had always claimed to love me like a sister. Their silence spoke volumes. I looked at Nancy's face, my only child, and searched for any trace of the little girl who once crawled into my bed during thunderstorms. Instead, I saw only coldness in her eyes, the same blue eyes she inherited from her father. "Nancy, I just want what Richard and I agreed upon," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I expected. "The house we built together, half of our savings, that's all." Matthew scoffed, wrapping his arm around Nancy's shoulder. "Brenda, be reasonable. Nancy is Richard's daughter, his only child. This inheritance should stay in the bloodline, as if I were just some stranger who had wandered into their lives. Not the woman who had spent 43 years married to Richard. Not the woman who had worked 2 jobs to put Nancy through medical school. Not the mother who had sacrificed everything." I closed the portfolio slowly, gathering the dignity I had left. Without a word, I stood up, smoothed my simple navy dress, the one I had bought on sale for Richard's funeral, and walked out. No one called after me. The elevator ride, down 16 floors, felt eternal. I stared at my reflection in the mirrored wall, a 65-year-old woman with silver-streaked hair, lines of worry etched around her eyes, and shoulders slightly stooped from years of carrying everyone else's burdens. Outside, the autumn air hit my face, cooling the burning humiliation on my cheeks. I walked 6 blocks before realizing I had no destination in mind. My home, correction, Richard's home according to Nancy, was a 30-minute drive away. The home where I had tended the garden for decades, where I had nursed Richard through his final illness, where every corner held memories of our life together. Found a bench in a small park and sat down, watching mothers push strollers and office workers hurry past with coffee cups. Normal people living normal lives, not women who had just been discarded by their only child. My phone buzzed. A text from Nancy. "Mom, we need to wrap this up quickly. Sign the papers Patterson sends over. Matthew knows a buyer for the house." No apology, no acknowledgement of what had just happened. Just business. The memory came unbidden. Nancy at 17, calling me at work, her voice frantic. "Mom, I wrecked the car. Dad's going to kill me." I had left work early, losing a day's pay to handle the situation before Richard found out. I had paid for the repairs from my own savings, the money I'd been putting aside for a community college course I wanted to take. One sacrifice among hundreds. Years of putting Nancy first, of working the night shift at the hospital so I could be home when she returned from school. Years of stretching every dollar to make sure she had dance lessons, science camp, the right clothes. I pulled out the faded photo I kept in my wallet, Nancy in her medical school graduation cap and gown, beaming between Richard and me. "I couldn't have done it without you guys," she had said that day, squeezing my hand. When had she changed? When had money become more important than family? Was it Matthew's influence, with his family's old money and disdain for those who actually worked for a living? Or had the seed always been there, planted by Richard's indulgence? 3 days, I decided. I would give myself 3 days to figure. out what to do next. 3 days to accept that the daughter I raised now thought I deserved to live with stray dogs rather than receive my fair share of the life Richard and I had built together. I rose from the bench, suddenly aware of the curious glances from passers-by, an old woman crying in public, how undignified. Richard always hated public displays of emotion. My phone buzzed again. Matthew this time. "Nancy's upset. Sign the papers, Brenda. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I turned off my phone and slipped it into my purse. Then I walked to the bus stop, calculating how much money I had in my personal account, the one Richard didn't know about, the one where I'd been putting small amounts away for years. Not much, but enough for a small apartment, perhaps. Enough to start over at 65. What Nancy and Matthew didn't know, what no one knew, was that I had my own surprise waiting. One that would change everything in exactly 3 days. My small apartment felt emptier than usual that night. I'd rented it 6 months ago after Richard's diagnosis, when the tension with Nancy and Matthew had become unbearable. Just temporary, I had told myself then, until Richard gets better. But Richard never got better. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on. The building was modest but clean, mostly occupied by retirees and young singles just starting out. No one asked questions here. No one knew I was Richard Harrington's widow. The Richard Harrington who had built one of the most successful local construction companies in Ohio before selling it 5 years ago. The tea grew cold as I pulled out a weathered shoebox from under my bed. Inside were fragments of a life Nancy knew nothing about, photos, letters, and documents I had kept hidden for decades. There was Richard and me on our wedding day, both just 22, full of dreams. I traced my finger over his handsome face, remembering how dazzled I had been by his charisma, his ambition. I had been working as a nurse when we met, but Richard insisted I stop after Nancy was born. "My wife doesn't need to work," he'd proclaimed proudly to everyone. What no one knew was how quickly his pride turned to control. I found the photo from Nancy's 5th birthday, her beaming at the camera, showing off the beautiful doll Richard had bought her. What the picture didn't show was the argument the night before, when I had suggested the doll was too expensive. It didn't show the bruise on my arm, carefully covered by a cardigan. "You always were good at hiding things, Brenda," I whispered to myself. The phone rang, startling me. Nancy's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then listened immediately. "Mom, this is ridiculous. You can't just walk out of a meeting like that. It's embarrassing." Her voice was tight with annoyance. "Call me back. We need to sort this out before you make things worse." Make things worse? I almost laughed. What could be worse than being told by your only child that you deserve to live with stray dogs? I put the phone down and pulled out another photo. Nancy at her wedding 5 years ago. She looked radiant, but I remembered the tension behind the scenes. Matthew's family had orchestrated every detail, making it clear that the Harrington name was what mattered, not the mother of the bride. Richard had gone along with it all, happy to impress his wealthy in-laws. My role had been reduced to smiling quietly and writing checks. The changes in Nancy had started subtly after she met Matthew, in her last year of medical school. Small things at first. Missed Sunday dinners, shortened phone calls, then larger absences. Holidays spent with Matthew's family instead of us. Explanations that his connections were important for her career. By the time they married, Nancy had transformed from my thoughtful daughter into someone who viewed me as little more than an obligation. Richard hadn't noticed or hadn't cared. His focus was on building his business and impressing his new son-in-law. I sipped my cold tea, remembering the worst betrayal, the day I discovered Richard and Nancy had reorganized the family finances without consulting me. I had accidentally found the papers in Richard's office, new trusts established, properties transferred, all carefully structured to minimize my control. "It's just estate planning, Brenda." Richard had explained dismissively when confronted. You've never understood finances. Nancy and Matthew thought this would be simpler for everyone. Simpler for everyone but me. The apartment buzzer interrupted my thoughts. At this hour? I approached the intercom cautiously. Brenda. It's Ellen from across the hall. Can I come up? I have something important to tell you. Ellen was the only neighbor I'd become friendly with, a retired school teacher with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. I buzzed her in. I saw you on the news, she said without preamble when I opened the door. Just a glimpse, coming out of the Wentworth building downtown. That's where all the fancy lawyers are. I felt the blood drain from my face. The news? Local. Coverage of that charity event in the same building. You were in the background, but I'd recognize you anywhere. Ellen studied me closely. You looked upset. Is everything all right? I hesitated, then gestured for her to sit down. In the 6 months I'd known Ellen, she'd never pried into my past. She knew I was a widow, nothing more. But something about her, direct concern, broke through my carefully constructed walls. My husband died 3 months ago, I said quietly. Today was the reading of his will. Ellen waited, her kind eyes encouraging me to continue. He left almost everything to our daughter and her husband. When I questioned it, my daughter said I deserved to live with stray dogs rather than receive my fair share. Saying it out loud made the pain fresh again. Ellen's eyes widened. That's horrible, Brenda. Just horrible. She shook her head. Why would she say such a thing? I sighed deeply. Money changes people. Or maybe it just reveals who they truly are. Ellen leaned forward. And what are you going to do about it? The question caught me off guard. In 43 years of marriage, few people had ever asked what I wanted to do. It was always about what Richard wanted, what Nancy needed, what would keep the peace. I'm going to fight, I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. Not just for the money, though God knows I earned my share. I'm going to fight for my dignity. Ellen nodded approvingly. Good. And how exactly will you do that? I smiled for the first time that day, thinking of the sealed envelope locked in my small safe. The envelope Richard's old friend and business partner Jack had given me 1 week before the official will reading. In 3 days, I said quietly. Nancy and Matthew are going to discover that Richard left them more than just his money. He left them a time bomb, and I'm the only one who knows how to defuse it. Ellen raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Do tell. But some secrets weren't ready to be shared, even with a friendly neighbor. Let's just say, I replied, that my husband may have finally done right by me, even if it was after his death. After Ellen left, I returned to the shoebox, pulling out one last photo, Richard and Jack at the groundbreaking of their first major project 30 years ago. Jack, who had seen firsthand how Richard treated me behind closed doors. Jack, who had always looked out for me in his quiet way. Jack, who had slipped me an envelope with instructions to open it only if things went badly at the will reading. Tomorrow, I would open that envelope. Tomorrow, I would begin to reclaim what was rightfully mine. Morning light filtered through my thin curtains as I sat at my small kitchen table, the sealed envelope from Jack before me. I'd slept poorly, dreams filled with Nancy's cold eyes and Richard's disapproving frown. Now, with trembling fingers, I broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter in Jack's neat penmanship and a USB drive. Dear Brenda, if you're reading this, then the will reading went exactly as Richard and I feared it might. I tried to talk sense into him for years about how he treated you, but you know how stubborn he was. It wasn't until the end, when he realized he was really dying, that something changed in him. One night at the hospital, when you'd gone home to rest, he broke down. He admitted that he'd been unfair to you, that he'd allowed Nancy and Matthew to influence him too much. He wanted to make amends, but was too proud to say it to your face. The enclosed drive contains documents you'll need: financial records, property deeds, and, most importantly, evidence of what Matthew has been doing with company funds. Richard discovered it 2 weeks before he died, but was too weak to confront him. Richard made me promise to give you this only if they tried to cut you out. He hoped they'd do right by you without coercion. Clearly, he didn't know his daughter, and son-in-law as well as he thought. Call me when you've reviewed everything. My lawyer is standing by. Your friend always. Jack, I stared at the letter, emotions warring inside me. Anger that Richard had waited until his deathbed to acknowledge decades of mistreatment. Relief that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. And a strange, simmering anticipation at what the USB drive might contain. My ancient laptop whirred to life, protesting as I inserted the drive. The first folder contained property deeds, including one I didn't recognize for a lake house in Michigan. Richard had bought it 3 years ago without telling me. The second folder held financial statements showing accounts I'd never seen, with substantial balances. The third folder was simply labeled Matthew. I clicked it open to find dozens of emails and financial documents. As I read, my hand flew to my mouth in shock. Matthew had been embezzling from the family business for years, siphoning funds into offshore accounts. The evidence was meticulous: bank transfers, altered records, even emails between Matthew and someone named Vince discussing how to hide the transactions from the old man. Richard had discovered everything but kept silent, gathering evidence. Instead, the last document was dated 2 weeks before his death, a revised will, properly notarized, leaving me half of all assets and appointing Jack as executor instead of Patterson. My phone rang, startling me. Nancy. Mom, this is ridiculous. We need your signature on these papers today. The buyers for the house are getting impatient. I took a deep breath. What buyers, Nancy? The Andersons. They've offered well above market value, but they need to close quickly. Matthew says, I'm not signing anything today, I interrupted, my voice calmer than I felt. Mom! Her exasperation crackled through the phone. Don't be difficult. This is a great opportunity. For whom? I asked quietly. For all of us. The sooner we liquidate Dad's assets, the sooner we can all move on. Move on. As if Richard's death was merely a business transaction to be completed efficiently. I'll need time to review everything with my lawyer, I said. There was a pause. Your lawyer? Since when do you have a lawyer? Since my daughter told me I deserve to live with stray dogs. Nancy sighed dramatically. You're blowing that way out of proportion. I was upset. You know how stressful this all is. Yes, I replied evenly. I do know stress. I know what it's like to lose my husband of 43 years and then be told, by my only child, that I don't deserve my fair share of the life we built together. Mom, I'll call you when I'm ready to discuss this further. I hung up before she could respond, my heart pounding. I'd never spoken to Nancy that way before. In our family, keeping the peace had always meant I was the one who compromised, who apologized, who gave in. Not anymore. I called Jack immediately. You've seen it all? He asked after I explained. Yes. I had no idea about any of it. The lake house, the accounts. Matthew. Jack's voice hardened. Richard suspected Matthew was stealing for nearly a year. He hired a private investigator to gather evidence. Why didn't he confront him? Or tell me? Pride, Jack sighed. He couldn't admit he'd been so wrong about Matthew, that he'd let him take control of so much, and he was worried about what it would do to Nancy. Always protecting Nancy, even from the consequences of her own choices. It was a pattern I recognized all too well. What should I do now? I asked. Meet me at my office at 2. Bring the drive. My lawyer will be there. Jack paused. Brenda, you should know. Matthew's in deep trouble beyond the embezzlement. The investments he made with that money? They're failing spectacularly. Word on the street is he's desperate for cash. That explained the rush to sell the house. It wasn't just greed, it was desperation. I spent the next hour making copies of everything on the drive, then dressed carefully in my best outfit, a simple navy pantsuit I'd bought for job interviews after Richard first got sick. Before Nancy and Matthew convinced me I wasn't needed at the company, as I locked my apartment door, Ellen emerged from hers. "You look different today," she observed. "More formidable." I smiled. "I feel different. Did you open that envelope you mentioned?" "I did." "And?" Her eyes twinkled with curiosity. "And I've discovered that even after 43 years of marriage, my husband could still surprise me." I checked my watch. "I'm sorry, I have to go. I'm meeting with a lawyer." Ellen patted my arm. "Go get him, Brenda." As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed with a text from Nancy. "Matthew's talking to Patterson about having you declared incompetent to make financial decisions. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. A threat, plain and simple." 6 months. Ago, it would have devastated me, sent me spiraling into anxiety and self-doubt. Today, it only strengthened my resolve. They had no idea what was coming. Jack's office felt like stepping into another world, all gleaming wood and glass, with views of the city skyline, so different from the small construction trailer where he and Richard had started their business 40 years ago. I'd brought them sandwiches in that trailer, helped with paperwork during those early struggling years. "Brenda." Jack rose from behind his desk, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. He looked older than his 67 years, grief having carved new lines around his eyes. He'd lost his best friend, and I'd lost a husband who had been both my protector and my jailer. "This is Diane Levinson," Jack said, indicating an elegant woman in a crisp suit. "Best lawyer in the state and a pit bull in negotiations." Diane's handshake was firm. "Mrs. Harrington, I've reviewed the documents Jack shared. You have a very strong position." We spent the next hour discussing strategy. The revised will, properly executed and notarized, superseded the one Patterson had presented. The evidence against Matthew was damning. With Jack as the newly appointed executor, we could immediately freeze the assets Nancy and Matthew were trying to liquidate. "What about the threat to have me declared incompetent?" I asked. Diane smiled thinly. "Let them try. I'd love to see them explain to a judge why a woman who independently managed household finances for decades suddenly became incompetent right when they want to sell off assets without her consent." My phone buzzed repeatedly during our meeting. Nancy, Matthew, even Patterson. I ignored them all. "You should prepare yourself," Diane warned as our meeting concluded. "Once we file these papers, things will get ugly. Nancy and Matthew won't give up easily." "I've lived with ugly for a long time," I replied. "At least now it will be out in the open." Jack walked me to my car. "Richard really did love you, Brenda, in his own broken way. This doesn't make up for everything, but it was his attempt at making things right." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "What do you say about a man who hurt you for decades, then tried to protect you after he was gone?" When I arrived home, a sleek black Mercedes was parked outside my building, Matthew's car. I found him and Nancy waiting at my door, both impeccably dressed, looking out of place in my modest hallway. "Finally," Nancy said, arms crossed. "We've been waiting for over an hour." I unlocked my door without responding and walked in. They followed uninvited. Nancy looked around my small apartment with poorly disguised disdain. "So, this is where you've been living? Why didn't you stay at the house?" "Would you have wanted me there?" I asked quietly, setting down my purse. "Of course," she said automatically, but her eyes slid away from mine. Matthew stepped forward, all business. "Brenda, we need to resolve this situation. The Andersons won't wait forever, and there are other matters requiring immediate attention." "What? Matters?" I asked, my voice deliberately neutral. Estate taxes, investment decisions, property management? He waved his hand dismissively. Details you don't need to worry about. Because I'm just a silly old woman who doesn't understand finances? I raised an eyebrow. Matthew's smile was patronizing. We're simply trying to make this easier for everyone. Grief can cloud judgment, and Nancy and I are better positioned to handle these complex decisions. Like you handled the company funds? I asked quietly. The color drained from his face. What? The company funds you've been embezzling for years. The money you've hidden in offshore accounts. The investments that are now failing catastrophically. Nancy looked between us, confused. Mom, what are you talking about? Matthew recovered quickly, his face hardening. This is absurd. You're clearly not thinking straight. I walked to my laptop, opened it and turned it to face them, displaying one of the incriminating emails between Matthew and his accomplice. Richard found out everything before he died, I said evenly. He just didn't live long enough to confront you. Nancy stepped closer, scanning the screen, her expression shifting from confusion to shock. Matthew? What is this? Matthew's composure cracked. It's nothing. Just business communications taken out of context. Your mother doesn't understand. I understand perfectly, I interrupted. And so did Richard. That's why he changed his will 2 weeks before he died. I handed Nancy a copy of the revised will. Her hands trembled as she read it. This can't be legal, she whispered. It's completely legal, I said. Properly witnessed and notarized. Jack is the executor now, not Patterson, and half of everything belongs to me. Matthew lunged for the papers. Let me see that. Nancy pulled back, still reading, her face growing paler. Dad left you the lake house? I didn't even know we had a lake house. There's a lot you don't know, I said gently. A lot Richard kept from both of us. Matthew paced the small room like a caged animal. This is a trick. Jack has always resented me. He planted this evidence. The evidence came from Richard, I said. And it's already with the district attorney's office. Matthew froze. You're bluffing. Am I? I held his gaze steadily. Nancy sank onto my sofa, the papers clutched in her hand. Matthew, just tell me it isn't true. His silence was answer enough. Get out, I said to Matthew, my voice quiet but firm. Nancy and I need to talk. Nancy comes with me, he snapped, grabbing her arm. She jerked away. Don't touch me. I need to understand what's happening. Matthew's face contorted with rage. You stupid, ungrateful. He caught himself, visibly struggling for control. Fine. Talk to your mother. See if I care. But remember who's supported your lifestyle all these years while she was working as a nurse. The door slammed behind him, leaving a ringing silence. Nancy stared at the papers in her hands. Is it true? All of it? Yes. And Dad knew? Before he died? I nodded. He left all the evidence with Jack, with instructions to give it to me only if you and Matthew tried to cut me out. Tears filled her eyes. I didn't know, Mom. About the embezzlement. About any of it. I believe you, I said, and I did. Nancy had changed, but I didn't think she was capable of that level of deception. Why didn't you tell me how bad things were with Dad? All those years. I sighed, suddenly feeling every one of my 65 years. I wanted to protect you, and I was ashamed. Admitting how he treated me meant admitting I stayed with a man who didn't respect me. Nancy's tears spilled over. And now I've become just like him, haven't I? Treating you like you don't matter. God, Mom, what I said at the lawyer's office. The apology I'd waited for hung in the air between us, unspoken but present. We have a lot to talk about, I said, neither accepting nor rejecting her implied remorse. But first, we need to deal with Matthew. He won't go quietly, especially now that he knows we have evidence against him. Nancy straightened, wiping her. Tears. What do we do? For the first time in years, she was looking to me for guidance rather than judgment. It felt like a tiny crack in a wall that had seemed impenetrable. We call Jack, I said, reaching for my phone. And then we prepare for battle. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of legal meetings and painful revelations. Jack's team moved swiftly to secure the assets, while Diane filed the necessary paperwork to validate Richard's updated will. Matthew had disappeared, his clothes gone from the house, his personal accounts emptied. Nancy had moved back to the family home, shell-shocked and silent. When I hadn't heard from her for a day, I drove to the house, my house, according to the revised will. It felt strange to use my key, to walk through the front door of the home I'd left 6 months ago. Everything looked the same. The antique grandfather clock in the foyer, the family photos arranged carefully on the mantel, the expensive furniture. Richard had insisted on buying to impress his clients. Nancy, I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. I found her in Richard's study, surrounded by open boxes and scattered papers. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. I've been going through Dad's things, she said without looking up, trying to understand who he really was, who any of us are. I sat in the leather chair across from her, watching as she methodically sorted through decades of Richard's life. Birth certificates, insurance policies, old photos, business contracts. I found these, she said finally, pushing a stack of letters toward me. They were hidden in a compartment in his desk. I recognized my handwriting immediately. Letters I had written to Richard during our courtship and early marriage, full of hope, dreams, and love. Letters I thought he had discarded years ago. He kept them all, Nancy said quietly. Every single one. My hands trembled as I touched the faded paper. I didn't think he cared that much. There's more. Nancy hesitated, then handed me a leather-bound journal. His private diary. I probably shouldn't have read it, but... She shrugged helplessly. I opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. Richard's bold handwriting filled the page. March 15, 2016, the doctors say it's cancer. Stage 4. I've got maybe a year, probably less. Haven't told Brenda or Nancy yet. Need time to put things in order first. Looking back on my life, I've built something significant. A successful business, a beautiful home, financial security, but at what cost? Brenda deserved better than the man I became. So focused on success that I forgot what really mattered. Jack was right all these years. I treated her like an employee rather than a partner. I let Nancy and Matthew push her aside, because it was easier than standing up to them. I've been a coward in ways that would shock anyone who knows me only in business. I turned the page with trembling fingers. April 3rd, 2016 told Brenda about the diagnosis today. No tears, just that quiet strength she's always had. Said she'd be with me every step of the way. After everything I've put her through, she still stands by me. I don't deserve her loyalty. Matthew came by later, already talking about reorganizing, the company selling assets. Something doesn't feel right about his eagerness. Need to watch him carefully. Nancy watched me read, her expression unreadable. Keep going, she urged. There's more. I flipped through several entries detailing Richard's suspicions about Matthew, his growing certainty that something was wrong with the company finances. Then I reached an entry that made my breath catch. May 20th, 2016 confirmed today what I've suspected for months. Matthew has been stealing from the company, millions over the past 3 years. He's made risky investments with that money and lost most of it. Worse, he's convinced Nancy that I'm becoming senile, that my paranoia about him is just the cancer affecting my mind. My own daughter believes I'm losing my mental faculties rather than considering that her husband might be a thief. Have I raised her to be so blind? Or has Matthew's influence changed her that completely? Jack is the only one I can trust now. We've documented everything. I've changed my will to protect Brenda, though I know she'll share with Nancy once the truth about Matthew comes out. Brenda always forgives too easily. It's her greatest strength and her greatest weakness. I closed the journal, overwhelmed. Did you read the last entries? Nancy nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. He knew he was dying. He knew what Matthew was doing, and he knew I'd chosen the wrong side. Her voice broke on the last words. You didn't know, I said gently. I should have. Her fist came down hard on the desk. I'm a doctor, for God's sake. I'm trained to observe, to notice details. But I was so wrapped up in the life Matthew promised, the prestige, the connections, the wealth, that I didn't see what was happening right in front of me. She looked up at me, her face crumpling. And I treated you terribly, just like Dad did all those years. The pain in her eyes was genuine, but I wasn't ready to absolve her completely. Yes, you did. Why didn't you ever fight back? With Dad? With me? With any of us? I considered the question carefully. I grew up believing that keeping the peace was more important than standing up for myself. That loving someone meant accepting whatever they gave you, even if it hurt. I ran my fingers over Richard's journal. But I was wrong too. By staying silent, I taught you that it was okay to treat me as less than. I enabled Richard's behavior, and later, yours. Nancy wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Can you ever forgive me? I already have, I said truthfully. But forgiveness doesn't mean we don't need to change. Both of us. She nodded slowly. I filed for divorce this morning. I don't know where Matthew is, but his lawyer contacted me. He's demanding half of everything. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. Just like I was. A small smile touched Nancy's lips. Except you actually deserved it. We sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by the paper fragments of Richard's life and the truths he'd kept hidden for so long. I spoke with Diane, Nancy said finally. About the evidence against Matthew. She says there's enough for criminal charges. I nodded. Jack mentioned that possibility. Do you want to pursue it? It would mean a public scandal, reporters, maybe even a trial. The old Brenda would have said no immediately, would have prioritized keeping the peace and avoiding embarrassment at all costs. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I think the truth needs to come out, I said slowly. Not for revenge, but because secrets have done enough damage to this family. Nancy reached across the desk and took my hand. Then we'll face it together, whatever comes next. It was the first genuinely warm contact between us in years. Her hand felt small in mine, reminding me of the little girl who used to need me to check under her bed for monsters. Now we were facing real monsters together, the consequences of decades of secrets and silence. There's something else, Nancy said, pulling a folder from the mess on the desk. Dad's lawyer, his real lawyer, not Patterson, contacted me yesterday. Dad set up a foundation in your name, the Brenda Harrington Foundation for Women's Education. It's fully funded and ready to launch. She handed me the folder. Inside were detailed plans for a scholarship program for women returning to education after raising families or caring for loved ones. He knew, I whispered, tears filling my eyes. He knew I always regretted not finishing my degree after we married. It's his legacy to you, Nancy said softly. Maybe his way of saying he understood what you sacrificed. As I leafed through the foundation documents, I felt a weight lifting. Not just the burden of recent events, but a lifetime of being silenced, of making myself small to accommodate others. For the first time in decades, I could see a future shaped by my own choices, not defined by Richard's demands or Nancy's expectations. A future where my voice mattered. Outside the study window, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across Richard's carefully tended garden. A garden that was now mine to tend, to change, or to reimagine completely. The choice was finally mine to make. 1 year later, I stood at the podium in the community college auditorium, looking out at the faces of 20 women who had just received the first Brenda Harrington Foundation scholarships. Their expressions mirrored what I felt in my heart: hope, determination, and the quiet joy that comes from being truly seen. "Each of you has a story," I said, my voice stronger than I ever remembered it being in public. "Each of you has put others first for years, sometimes decades. Today marks your turn to prioritize your dreams, your education, your future." In the front row, Ellen gave me a thumbs up. Beside her sat Jack, who had become not just a business ally but a dear friend over the past year. Nancy stood at the back of the room, clipboard in hand, efficiently managing the event she had helped organize. So much had changed in 12 months. Matthew had eventually been found in Mexico, attempting to start a new life with what remained of the money he'd embezzled. The legal proceedings were still ongoing, but he'd already agreed to a significant settlement in the divorce, hoping for leniency in the criminal case. Nancy had returned to practicing medicine full-time, specializing in geriatric care, a choice she'd made after reflecting on how society often silenced and sidelined the elderly, just as our family had done to me. As for me, I'd surprised everyone, including myself, by enrolling in college courses. At 66, I was finally pursuing the business degree I'd abandoned when I married Richard. My professors often asked me to share my real-world experience with younger students who seemed fascinated by my journey from silenced wife to foundation director. The foundation had become my passion. Working with Jack and a board of advisors, we had expanded its mission beyond scholarships to include mentoring, career counseling, and workshops on financial independence for women of all ages. After the ceremony, Nancy approached me, her professional demeanor softening. "That was a beautiful speech, Mom. Those women clearly connected with what you said." "I just told them the truth," I replied, gathering my notes. "That it's never too late to reclaim your voice." Nancy nodded, her eyes reflecting both sadness and understanding. "I've been thinking a lot about that lately, about voices and silence." She hesitated. "I found more of Dad's journals, earlier ones, from when I was a child." My heart quickened. "And?" "He wrote about the fights, Mom. The times he intimidated you, controlled the money, made all the decisions without consulting you." Her voice dropped. "He even wrote about hitting you once, when I was about 5. I closed my eyes briefly, remembering. I had bought a new dress without asking him first. He was so angry. I had no idea. Nancy's voice cracked. "All those years, I thought we were the perfect family. I thought Dad was this wonderful provider and you were just passive, unambitious." I touched her arm gently. "You were a child, Nancy. I wanted to protect you from knowing those things. But don't you see? By protecting me, you allowed me to believe a lie, to idolize a man who hurt you, to become someone who treated you the same way he did." The pain in her eyes was raw, genuine. We'd had many conversations over the past year, many moments of reconciliation, but this felt different, deeper, more honest. "I've been seeing a therapist," she admitted, trying to understand how I became someone who could say such cruel things to her own mother, who could tell you that you deserved to live with stray dogs. I winced at the reminder of those words, still sharp even a year later. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Nancy continued. "I just want you to know that I'm trying to be better, to unlearn the patterns Dad established and I perpetuated." I studied my daughter's face, the determined set of her jaw, so like Richard's, but the vulnerability in her eyes that was entirely her own. "We're both learning," I said finally. "Me to speak up, you to listen. It's progress." Jack approached, breaking the moment. Sorry to interrupt, but the caterers need to know where to set up for the reception. Nancy checked her watch. I'll handle it. The donors will be arriving soon. She squeezed my hand before hurrying off. Jack watched her go, then turned to me, with a raised eyebrow. Everything okay? Getting there, I replied. One conversation at a time. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Richard would be proud of what you've accomplished with the foundation. Maybe, I said thoughtfully. But I didn't do it for him. I did it for me. And for women like me. Jack smiled. That's why it's working. Speaking of which... He hesitated, suddenly uncharacteristically nervous. I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner with me next week. Not to discuss foundation business, just dinner. I felt a flutter of surprise, followed by a warm sense of possibility. Jack had been Richard's friend for decades, but in the past year, he'd become something else to me. A confidant, a supporter, a man who saw me clearly and valued what he saw. I'd like that, I said simply. Later that evening, after the reception ended and the last guests departed, I returned to my new home, a comfortable condo overlooking the park, purchased with my portion of the inheritance. It was nothing like the grand house Richard and I had shared, but it was entirely mine, decorated to my taste, arranged for my comfort. On the wall hung a simple framed quote that Ellen had given me as a housewarming gift. The quietest voice, when finally raised, can shake mountains. I ran my fingers over the frame, thinking about the journey of the past year. From the humiliation in the lawyer's office to this moment of peace and purpose, the path had been neither straight nor easy. There had been legal battles, painful revelations, difficult conversations, and moments when reconciliation seemed impossible. But there had also been discoveries, of strength I didn't know I possessed, of friends who stood by me when I finally stood up for myself, of a daughter who was capable of growth and change, and of a voice that, though long silenced, had never completely disappeared. I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped onto my balcony. The evening air was soft with approaching summer, the park below vibrant with life, families walking together, elderly couples on benches, young people throwing frisbees, all coexisting in the gathering twilight. My phone chimed with a text from Nancy. Just wanted to say I'm proud of you, Mom. See you Sunday for dinner? I smiled as I typed my response. Looking forward to it. Setting down my phone, I gazed out at the city lights beginning to twinkle against the darkening sky. In the distance, I could just make out the illuminated sign of the community college where I was taking classes, where today's ceremony had celebrated women reclaiming their futures. At 66, I was finally the author of my own story. The legacy I would leave wasn't just the foundation bearing my name, but the example of a woman who had learned, even late in life, that her voice mattered, that she mattered. Richard's final gift hadn't been the revised will or the foundation funding. It had been the push I needed to discover that I could stand on my own, that I had always been capable of more than either of us had believed. I raised my glass in a silent toast to the woman I had become and to the women who would benefit from the foundation in years to come. Women who would learn earlier than I had that they deserved to be heard, to be respected, to be valued. The inheritance that truly mattered wasn't measured in dollars or property deeds. It was the dignity I had reclaimed, the voice I had found, and the peace I had made with my past. That was a legacy worth passing on. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.